On 7th April 2025, curators and cultural theorists Nancy Adajania and Ranjit Hoskote interacted with Bengaluru School of Visual Arts students for more than 2 hours.
So when you talk about the avant-garde, it's always about something that gets ruptured with a schism and you can move ahead. So it's a break with the past and a movement towards the future. So that's how the avant-garde in a way functions art historically. But also the problem with the avant-garde is that what was the avant-garde of yesterday becomes museumized today and therefore loses the dynamism of that particular moment. It can be easily museumized and put into an institution, and it loses that particular power and relevancy of why it was the avant-garde of the past. But let me ask you, why are you interested in this particular aspect of art history?
I guess because I want my art to be museumized long after I'm gone.
That's interesting. You want it to be museumized, yes.
After I'm gone.
Yeah, after you're gone, for sure. It could even be museumized while you're still on Earth, so you don't have to wait.
Your avant-garde is not possible.
No, it is. I mean, Vivan Sundaram, I would say is one of our pioneering avant-garde artists, and his work, was shown in museums while he was still alive. I mean, he just passed away recently. So, there's no ban on an avant-garde artist's work being museumized. But that's not the point. I mean, instead of thinking about the fact that you want your work to be museumized or validated. No, I know that. I mean, that's a joke. But I'd like to know how do you conceive the avant-garde in the present? From your perspective, what is it that you'd like to break away from? That's the
notion that art and aesthetics are subject. I want to introduce a kind of Jnana Yoga inquiry into art, where art is inquiry into truth and research, but in a sense of mathematical absoluteness, objectivity, the non-dualism. Because subject-object disappears in truth, embodied truth or enlightenment states. So I think art as objective, that's the paradigm I'm working. Like art as ontology, or like the full spectrum color kshetra. Yes, I dance, yes, I paint, yes, I sing, but yes, I like every color. I'm going to do bridal headdresses. There are 64 back then, but now with the hyper specialization, we have so many more colors. So is there a polymath who can do all of them with excellence and deliver? I want to be that.
And at a practical level, what are the forays that you've done? What are the at a practical level? How do you manifest what you have just spoken about? How do you manifest your concept at a practical level?
So today was singing practice and Friday, Saturday, Sunday dance. I'm already pretty good at many things, but I haven't hit all 64 yet. I can say I've hit 17, and slowly I'm going to move towards that.
So you may engage with various disciplines, but at the end of it, how do you really bring them together, and why do you even want to bring them together? I mean, I think those are the questions that you need to ask yourself, because to pick up different disciplines or different genres and to excel at them, that's not being an avant-garde artist. That's not at all being an avant-garde artist.
There has never been a color kshetra. Even Lord Sri Krishna, they didn't have all 64 colors. So the notion of a color kshetra is avant-garde to me, because there's a whole dichotomy between color and the Western notion of art. And both of them haven't been resolved yet. So that tension hasn't been resolved in modernism, postmodernism. And resolving the tension successfully on an international scale, at which a living artist is canonized and you can conduct high-value sales while you're alive, while you're young. That's never been done in the world. That's the avant-garde position. I mean, you have...
Would you like to also go in?
I'm just thinking of, to situate your inquiry in a larger cultural context. I think you see a contradiction, which is your idea of the 64 colors points us in the direction of the Vishnu memory. Sorry? The
the
Vishnu Dharmottara
Puran.
where, you know, each time it's a dialogue between a king and a sage, and each time there's a suggestion that you could master one art, the teacher says you need to master this other art. I mean, to summarize, it's the notion that to master any art, you have to have some mastery over all the other arts. But then, I think the ethic there is not about discipline mastery over all those arts, but to distill something out of them all. And then have that distilled spirit inform whatever art you're engaged in. And I don't know, honestly, what place that kind of pedagogy has in the art world as we understand it, or where your idea of the avant-garde is coming from. It's also respectfully in relation to Gita and Vedant's strong advocacy of the avant-garde. I'm no longer sure whether that is a meaningful concept, especially in our cultural and political situation. Because to be avant-garde, you have to be avant of something. Right? And Robert Storr used to say this, return that term to the French military, where it came from.
It comes from the, yeah. No, absolutely. So, in fact, I think that makes sense. Yeah. In fact, I've written about this as well. So, I'm by no means a votary of the avant-garde, as you know. I mean, you might have found some references in my writings as well on this subject, because I do not believe in absolute ruptures, because I always feel that when you have an absolute rupture, whether it is in art or in politics, it gives rise to very ugly demons. For example, the rise of the Hindu right wing today is because we did not have a discussion about religion in post-independent India. Not a retrogressive idea, but even a more progressive discussion about religion. That is why today we have, the rise of the Hindu right wing, and we see, the consequences of that particular ideological, emergence. So whether it is in politics or whether it is in art, I am not interested in absolute ruptures. I am interested in something which is more incremental, and that is the way I see art making as well as art history and its writing. By the incremental, I mean something that is additive. Yeah, and that which is additive takes cognizance of what has happened in the past, weaves it with the present, and can also move forward into the future, and can move back and forth. So I'm always interested in something that's additive, incremental. I'm not interested in something that just makes an absolute rupture, because a rupture also means that you have to then suppress what has happened earlier, and to me that's counterproductive. It also means that you're spending a lot of energy in trying to get away from something. But as against that, and what I've written in one of my texts, in one of my exhibition texts in the K G Subramanyam show, is I would quote Krishnamurti here. Krishnamurti talks about how you should not be battling with the past. You should, he talks about the dying of the past. And he talks about how, if you are always battling with the past, then you are engaged in a war which is always phrased as a freedom from something. And when you're trying to, engage in freedom from something, you're using up a lot of your energy and your, subconscious, the power of your subconscious for that. Instead, Krishnamurti talks about freedom towards. And freedom towards helps you to actually achieve something that is much more emancipatory, something that actually takes you forward, rather than something that always means that you're battling with the past, with the demons of the past. So I mean, for me, if you ask me, I'm not interested so much in the idea of the avant-garde. I would rather phrase it through this Krishnamurti idea of freedom towards, rather than freedom from something.
Are you open to criticism of that?
Yeah, we are having a dialogue. So it's not about
Sorry, if
criticism.
anyone has anything else.
It's Yeah, and also I think other people also
Yeah,
should
that's
have a
why-
chance to
that's
talk
why I'm
because
not
it should not.
I just wanted to ask, as a curator, what kind of piece does curating bring to you, and how can I imbibe that into my? Because I have very few pieces, and also I want to know how I can bring what you've done here into my practice, into my day, and how could I make that a thing for me?
So are you a student of art history?
Yeah, no,
or-
I'm a student of sculpting. I'm a sculpture student, but also like the idea of curating my work and archiving my work or digitizing it, that interests me. So I want to know what kind of steps I would take as someone with a few pieces or who's just starting off. Like, what would you suggest what I do if that's just my question.
So when you say what I have done here, for instance,
Right.
what aspect of what I have done here is something that that you relate to? What is that aspect?
So your interpretations of the past, I really enjoyed, like through your eyes, I really enjoyed that the most. I mean the works as well, the work as well, but I really enjoyed that when you brought Cat Boy. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Girl Cat Boy, yes.
I thought that was just amazing, and why, and what the intention and what kind of joy it brings you. I'm curious.
So yes, curation does bring me a lot of joy. The conceptualizing before entering into the exhibition and then making that exhibition, which has then a whole lot of other infrastructural and logistical issues. But way before that, there is a stage when I'm just conceptualizing what I want to do. And that's the moment which brings me the greatest joy, because those are the baby steps that I'm taking before things consolidate
Right.
and become what you see. So, in fact, somebody asked me, I think yesterday, about my curatorial method, and I would actually borrow, a model from anthropology, and I'm alluding here to Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, and she talks about the divinatory method. And by the divinatory method, she means that after she's done her research, how does she relay that research to the public through her writing? And to be able to find a pattern in that research, in a kind of vast amount of material that she has collected from her fieldwork, how does she find that pattern? How does she find that thread in that labyrinth?
Right.
So she does. So she talks about the divinatory method, which is that the divinatory method is where you allow those little scraps of information, fragments of ideas, etc., and you actually engage with them in an intuitive manner, in a divinatory manner. You're divining, a pattern through all that thick description to arrive at something. So to arrive at something before, as she says, meaning stabilizes. And I find that very fascinating. But of course, I should also have a kind of a cautionary tale here, which is that you cannot just jump to the divinatory method. You have to first have years of knowledge, discipline, research. So whatever I'm putting in this show is not just something that I did in terms of a few months of research for this show. It is all the knowledge that I continue to accumulate and sift throughout my life, throughout the decades of writing and thinking and learning and curating. So you have to arm yourself with knowledge consistently, with discipline. That's extremely important. But then after that process, after you've done your initial research and all the years of accumulated research and knowledge, then you allow yourself to go into that particular phase, of that divinatory phase, where you are able to intuit research patterns before, as she says, meaning stabilizes, before you then move into this area of creating a kind of cognitive knowledge. So before that, there is that moment, and it's in that moment that I actually make all my conceptual leaps. And those are the conceptual leaps that you then see in the show.
That is from a studio practice.
Exactly. So a curator also, it does work as an artist. When I make my shows, for me, my entire show is like an artwork. It's not just about putting a few works next to each other, explaining a few phases of the artist's practice. As you can see, I start the show in medias res, suddenly in the middle of K G Subramanyam's practice. And the reason also why I did this was because to some extent K G Subramanyam's work can be accessed through the net. People have some knowledge of his work, and there are others, of course, who are his students who have greater knowledge. But the problem is that K G Subramanyam's practice has always been shown through a kind of chronological phase, and it has also never been contextualized in the way that I've done it, which is to world K G Subramanyam's practice, to bring in his Shantiniketan masters, to create what I call unpredictable adjacencies between his work and the works of other Shantiniketan masters, but also going outside of Shantiniketan and Baroda to show K G Subramanyam's practice, his graphic style, and then to bring in Prasanna Rao from Karnataka, a student he met in Shantiniketan for the first time, and the kind of shadowgraphy that he was doing at that time, which KGS saw in Shantiniketan. So then I make that connection that when you look at the silhouettes that he makes in his children's books, which I have then amplified and turned them into artworks, between the shadowgraphy of Prasanna Raghav Rao and KGS's children's book. Again, while I'm looking through the research archives at Seagull, for instance, I'm also looking at things which others would have just not bothered to look at or would have seen as just some kind of scraps. But I look at those things carefully and I find something important in them. So apart from the images of the murals, KGS's murals in Shantiniketan and Baroda and elsewhere, I also have in the vitrine his preparatory drawings. And in those preparatory drawings, you realize that there is very little which is in common between those drawings and the final, manifestation of the murals. And that's where, again, something very interesting happens. So you see that the Kamadhenu that is there in the Gandhi Darshan mural, for instance, is built from Paul Clay's New Angel. So so again you're seeing that. So I'm again thinking, why? I don't have all the answers, because it's not about finding a resolution, but about being able to prompt and provoke the viewer through these irresolutions. So imagine a Kamadhenu with this Gandhian quote that KGS has, which says that अगर भारत में गाँवों का नाश होगा तो भारत का भी नाश होगा. Now, this whole idea of the Gandhian village republic, he's thinking about in the 70s. He's thinking about what is the political situation that India finds itself in. Have we really been able to work towards a true a real understanding of Swaraj as Gandhi meant it? So all these questions are going on in his head, but there's also Paul Clay's Angel of History. So these are the ways in which you actually are able to bring alive an artist's work. So for me, it's a lot of research that you do in a very systematic manner, very rigorous manner, and I constantly I'm underlining the importance of rigor, because you often find in the art world that people just come upon something, they haven't really thought it through, then they keep forcing that idea again and again, and then even when you question them, they will still stick to it. And the reason for that is that there isn't enough systematic criteria. In art history also, for instance, although there is historiography and citations, people often just come up with things. They are not able to substantiate why they are saying what they are saying. And more than any other discipline, I think, especially in the art world, people can write and say anything without backing it with knowledge. And I think, therefore, it is even more important in such a situation to not, sort of come under the sway of charlatans of all kinds, but to be rigorous. We do have a past, we do have an art historical past. Read that art history. You cannot, just go into a mode of rupture against something unless you know what the past is. I remember Shyam Benegal, for instance, who was one of the pioneers of new wave, Indian cinema. Actually, talked about how you, of course, you need to break, the grammar, but to break the grammar, you need to know the grammar. So you have to know that grammar, and therefore you have to, as I always say, arm yourself with knowledge. You have to study very, very rigorously, and I can't repeat that enough. So that then you don't come under the sway of charlatans or people who just come up with something for which they can't substantiate, and then they'll just keep repeating that. So don't come into that sway. You must be. I mean, I have a background in political science and filmmaking. I studied art history on my own. I am an autodidact, but I am a systematic autodidact, and that is extremely important to remember.
There's sometimes a feeling that the curator should, how should I put it, be in complete sympathy with the artist or the historical moment that's being surveyed. That you can have a situation where you have points of disagreement with the artist whose work you're looking at, or the historical period, or the school, whatever it is you're surveying. So in that context, maybe we want to draw you out precisely because you mentioned this notion of the village, because KG's worldview was largely Gandhian. Your own politics is far more inflected by an Ambedkarite vision. So when you come upon Gandhi's notions of the village here, what's your sense of, how do you respond and how do you bear witness to that response? It's maybe something to talk about.
Thank you so much for bringing that in. But first I'd just like to say that I belong to a family which of course believed in the philosophy of Nehru, but also of Gandhi. But we were more Gandhian than Nehruvians. And the reason for that is that my family had a connection with Gujarat, especially when I was growing up. So we also had a family home in Bilimora. And because of that Gujarati ethos, Gandhian stories were constantly repeated by family members. One of the first books that I was given, which I remember, apart from the Russian, fairy tale books that my mother brought me, which had the most brilliant illustrations, was an abridged version of my experiments with truth. And so that was the kind of Gandhian ethos that I grew up with. Of course, the moment I went to college, there were many political, events that happened which changed the way I looked at Gandhian philosophy. And those were, of course, the Mandal agitation, the Bombay riots in 1992.
Anyone here remembers or knows those?
Yes, because those were the the events that actually basically those were the events that that ignited our political consciousness and have made us who we are. We both studied in the same college. We both studied political science. So. As I started reading Ambedkarite, philosophy, as I started engaging with it, I realized that I could not just, talk about the Gandhian ideas of the village republic, Gandhian ideas of a kind of fiduciary model of, where the upper caste will take care of the lower caste, and where the lower caste will have to sort of, wait upon the benevolence of the upper caste for their lives to change. And so what I'm also sharing with you is that your own perspective can change through knowledge, through political events that change your perspective, that change the way in which you think. And as I started engaging with Ambedkarite philosophy, I realized that the Gandhian fiduciary notion is no longer tenable. And anyways, the Gandhian village republic idea was also a kind of romantic idea, because as Ambedkar would say, you cannot just think of an ideal village republic, because there are always people, especially people from the so-called lower caste, who are never given a place within that village. They have to live on the outskirts. And so I bring some of those ideas to play in the exhibition pedagogy of my KGS show as well. But when I bring it in, I do not do it in a destructive manner. I do not do it in a manner which is, I want to criticize KGS. It isn't this kind of kind of superficial, showing off manner. Not at all. I do it, and I'm very happy you brought this point up. I do it in a way which points up the ambivalences and contradictions in the artist. I do it with respect and love and affection for the artist. I do it with the affection which actually helps you to understand the artist in a larger frame. So my criticism doesn't take away from the artist. It actually helps you to understand him better. So it's also about how do you criticize, not just, I'm not interested. I'm in my early 50s, if I was in my 20s, then I might have sort of taken that kind of a stance. I know that in my own practice, my own ideological positions have changed, have been refined with what I have read, with what I have seen. So, similarly with KGS, I'm happy to be critical of his work, but that criticism is always done in a way which comes from A, place of knowledge, and B, which points out the contradictions, such that it also helps us to see the contradictions in our own lives and in our own thinking. So that's the reason why I'm critical. Not critical to sort of, to sort of basically, display any kind of one-upmanship. It is the kind of criticism that helps us understand ourselves better, to understand our history better, to understand our politics better. So even with all the artists who are assembled here, or artistry students, I think that's very important. But to be able to arrive at this tonality, it has taken me many years as well. It's not just something that I would just do overnight. So I think that everything takes time, and the most important thing is that you have to be open and receptive to receive something, whether it is a political agitation, whether it's an philosophical idea. Being open is the most important lesson that I could share with you. That helped me. If you are not open, or if you think that you know everything, you will never ever be able to stand outside of yourself and to be able to see the world through a critical lens. Being open also means that things will come to you through serendipity. And I'm saying this out of experience. They actually come to you if you're truly open. If your openness is not just a kind of tokenistic gesture, but it is something which is genuine, which is honest. And that openness immediately means that the right kind of people will come to you, will guide you. You will start seeing the kinds of things which perhaps are there in the corners or in the margins, which you had never seen, but you will start seeing them. And this is not just some, mumbo jumbo. This I speak out of my own experience. So being receptive is extremely important.
Has there been any situation where you as a curator has an idea towards a particular display, but the artist does not agree with it? What do you do then?
That's a very good artist who is no longer there, but he's blessing us from the beyond. But of course, there are also, worshippers of KGS, who would not want to have any kind of a critical perspective on his practice. So that would create a little bit of an issue. But I think that can also be resolved through discussion, and through clarifications. But when you're working with a living artist, what happens is that, yes, there is a lot of kashmakash, to use the Urdu word. Yeah? So there are curators who will basically do whatever the artist wants them to do, and so therefore they become the voice of the artist and just relay exactly what the artist wants, which is fine. That's one kind of curation. But as you know the kind of person I am, and as I was also saying in my opening speech, I believe in jukti tako argapo. I believe in arguments, debates, and stories. Yeah? So I'm not somebody who can just relay whatever the artist has said or whatever spiel the artist has been doing for the last 40 or 50 years. Especially because I've done major retrospectives of artists like Sudeep Patwardhan, Navjot Altaf. I have co-curated the Melli Gobai retrospective with Ranjit Hoskote, and so forth. I've also done the Nelly Setna retrospective. So this question is very appropriate, the one you're asking. Nelly Setna, of course, had already passed away. And that was a different story where I had to really put together all the pieces of research because there was nothing available, you know. So that was a lot of hard work, and I mean, it was a different kind of a rabbit hole that I had to go into. But as far as working with Sudeep Patwardhan, for instance, or Navjot Altaf, like with Sudeep Patwardhan, for instance, even the very title of the show is mine, Walking Through Soul City. Ek Sair Roo Ke Sheher, you know. So he gave me that space because that was the kind of respect that I was given by the artist. He allowed me to develop my own concept. Not all artists allow you to do that because when they have reached a certain age and they are having their first important retrospective at NGMA Bombay, they may not want a curatorial intervention, right? But here was Sudeep Patwardhan, and I really respect him for that, and I'm grateful to him for that. That from the title of the show to the concept of the show, where I don't just repeat the cliches about his practice that he's talking about the history of the city or about the laboring body, but I talk about his particular form of realism, and then I parse that realism in his painting through the notion of philosophical idealism. So when you were talking about realism, you are really basically thinking about what you see, through a kind of retinal kind of perception, right? And then that retinal perception is anchored through a particular ideological position. In Sudeep Patwardhan's case, it would be his leftist position, right? But I went beyond that. I talk about this interplay between his leftist position, his affinity for historical materialism, and his affinity for a certain philosophical idealism. So I created a kind of complex reading of his practice. Now he also allowed me to do that. He did not have a problem that I wasn't just repeating A, the things that he had said about his own paintings, and B, the things that were just being repeated over the years about his practice. But there was one thing that he did not allow me to do, one argument that I could not win, and that was that he wanted huge numbers of works. So even though he allowed me to create constellations, so it wasn't just one painting after another, I created very interesting constellations and stories the way I always do in my curated show, but I could not have enough space between those constellations like I have in my Chitrakala Parishath. There's enough space, breathing space between the artworks for you to be able to take in the different stories. For Sudhir, it is very important to have n number of works, even more than what the NGMA could take. And that was one battle that I lost. But as you know, in any relationship, whether it's between two friends or between an artist or a curator, there's always a give and take. He gave me the respect as an art historian, as a curator, from the very title to the concept of the show, to even the placements and the constellations. He gave me that entire freedom. But what he did not budge on was the number of works. So that give and take is always there between a curator and an artist. But let me tell you, it is really very difficult. It requires a lot of sparring, dialogue, negotiation. It's not easy. And sometimes you may, lose the battle as well. Sometimes some curators have to just do exactly what the artist wants. So that's also.
See, you face the same situation or communication with the artists. If we talk about the contemporary artists, for example, last I was there in Taj Gallery when you curated Sohrab Rasani's show, printmaking show. So, but when we talk about size of artwork, so it's depend on gallery. For example, if you go to Mascara, they have huge space, so they can accommodate big artwork. So, okay, coming back to the question. So, when there are Sudeep Patwardhan, or if I talk about contemporary artists, was that communication? Are you communicating in that same way when you're communicating or discussing artwork with Sudeep Patwardhan or with Sohrab? And Sohrab Rasani is just a contemporary artist. So what's the way or what's the language you guys interact interact, in what language you interact?
I mean, they're all contemporary artists of different generations, of course. I mean, even when I'm writing a catalog essay, for instance, and that's why it's very important for me to have a one-on-one with the artist, because nowadays people want to immediately sort of, fish out their, phone camera and start, sort of recording everything. And I think that it's not always a good idea, because some conversations need to, you need to have them indoors, because if I were to have a critical conversation with an artist in the public, then that artist might get defensive, and it will be counterproductive, and it will never really, reach any particular, point of, it would not sort of be of any use to the artist, because the artist would immediately sort of close up and would not want to engage in any further conversation. So when I write catalog essays also, I have these one-on-ones, and when I have these one-on-ones, not only do I talk about things that really work beautifully, but I also talk about things that don't work. And therefore, for in many decades now, most of my writing has been on women artists, different generations of women artists, and it doesn't matter whether they are senior to me or my age or younger than me. I have always had very beautiful conversations where they can ask me questions and I ask them questions about their practice. So I think it doesn't really matter, age is not important, but I think it's about finding that right intellectual bandwidth, and also that right emotional bandwidth. It's both, I think sometimes you may find one and not the other, so then you remain unconvinced.
There's a very particular sanctity to the studio visit, and I think that's been important for both of us, and also to the curators who inspired us. Maybe a little bit, right? Do you want to talk about Okwe?
Why don't you talk about Okwe? Yeah.
There's the silences during a studio visit are as important as anything that's said, and sometimes you can approach the work of an artist by very roundabout ways. You might seem to be talking about something else and not the work, and it casts light on the work. Or an artist might say something to you which seems to not have anything to do with the art under discussion, but that it's a kind of a deep revelation of personality. So I think there's a particular quality of attentiveness that as curators or as writers on art we find ourselves developing, and I think it's crucial to our practice to have that. And I think it was also something we learned, because remember that when we began to curate, nowhere in the world were there curatorial studies programs. It's not, even Goldsmiths hadn't even started their programs at that point. So I think we were in fact very fortunate to have learned curation in a very hands-on, handcraft kind of way, and to also have had actually deeply they've been lifelong relationships of apprenticeship at first, then friendship with curators who were very inspiring, and for what it's worth, it came out of connections that weren't here. So it was someone like Okwe and Wizor who was a mentor to us. He curated a very crucial edition of the Documenta. Passed away far too early, but Okwe was Nigerian American to begin with, so he had this immense sense of needing to speak from somewhere that's not the center, so everything he did, and he created some incredible exhibitions, Documenta 11 and a number of other shows, where he shifted the emphasis from a very complacent West European, North American kind of way of looking at things to seeing what's happening in Lagos, what's happening in Delhi, what's happening in Bangkok, what's happening in Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, these were crucial questions for him. Likewise, Hans Ulrich Oberst was another source of inspiration and a friend and a colleague. With Hans Ulrich, it was this sense of being constantly on the move to get a sense of the historical moment. What is the temperature of the present? So there's again that kind of attentiveness to see not only art objects and art practices, but to look at the culture and the political scenario that they're responding to at that time. And once again, it certainly helped us to develop exhibitions and an exhibition making practice that takes this larger, more maximal kind of vision. Yeah. So I just thought that again, I think for both of us, it's very important to always preserve the spirit of apprenticeship. the minute you have, I think we're both very suspicious of this idea of mastery. I mean, you can, of course, achieve mastery at what you should strive for excellence in whatever you do. But if you come to the idea that, you are excellent and will always be, that's the end of your practice, whatever, whether you're an artist or a curator or a writer. I think it's always important to be in that mode where there's more to learn, there's more to understand about your own practice, the practice of the people you're dealing with, your interlocutors. So I think that's something that I would put in place. So for us also, it's been important to think about these exemplars and their practices. In a way, Hans Ulrich Obrist really researched curatorial practices that had never been written about. Museum directors in Germany between the wars, for instance. So many people whose practices no one had bothered to study because no one saw them as curators. They were seen as cultural organizers or entrepreneurs in culture. So it's also important to look in, you should say that because it's your favorite phrase, looking in the wrong place.
Yeah, looking in the wrong place, yeah. So yeah, one of my favorite phrases is looking in the wrong place, because many of the art historical answers that you're looking for, you will not find them in conventional art history. So when I curate my shows, for instance, they are not just conventional art historical shows which will deal with painting, sculpture, installation, or even video art. They might actually look at the intersection between art and design, or art, painting and underground cinema, So those are also the kinds of shows that I have done. I'm more interested in these kinds of intersections, which then lead to an art practice which may not be recognized by the conventional or mainstream art world. For example, an artist like Dashrath Patel. He was a painter, a designer, a photographer, a ceramicist, and when he taught at the National Institute of Design, he was also, the state would commission the National Institute of Design faculty to make installations for the World Expos, whether they were in New York or elsewhere, in Japan and other places. And Dashrath Patel, and I've written about him, so you can look up my essay on academia.edu about the subject. So Dashrath and other faculty and students, for instance, they would find ways of making installations, and I'm talking about the mid-60s and late 60s and 70s, at a time when the notion of an installation didn't even exist within the Indian art world. Even expanded sculpture only comes in the mid-80s, and installation art in the 90s. And yet, people like Dashrath Patel, his faculty and other students, they were making these installations which were working with technology which again was not being used within the gallery sphere. So they were working with these kind of multiple projections, which again was not something that you saw within the art world. You only see that happening later, in the late 90s and early 2000s. So through their form of experimentation and ingenuity, they were doing things which were far ahead of their times. So my role as an art historian has been to find those wrong places, has been to find those lost histories. The histories that, because what is the reason why for a long time those aspects of Dashrath Patel were not talked about? The reason was that they did not see them, they saw them as something lesser, because art intersecting with the field of design, art intersecting with the world, with the context of World Expos. So the World Expos were seen as something which would contaminate the pure white cube gallery space. So I think it's very important to again look at the margins, look into the wrong places.
Our time on campus, I mean, it's actually been wonderful for us to be on your campus and to interact with you. It set me thinking of when we went to college. It was politically a terrible time, and as I say that, it is every time is politically terrible. But I think in the late 80s, early 90s, it's incredible how we were politicized on campus because there were so many things going critically wrong with the country. And each of them, in some way, was a lesson to us. On the one hand, there was, I don't know if anyone even remembers this, the Narmada Bachao Andolan. It was
In the 80s.
yeah, the 80s. So the Narmada and the Chipko Andolan were very crucial. So we were radicalized into an understanding of ecological activism. In the college we went to, Elphinstone College in Bombay, also always had a large northeastern contingent that came. So because we personally had friends who came from Manipur, Nagaland, Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, there was a visceral understanding of everything that was going wrong there, and many things were going wrong there. There was the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, there were insurrections, there was army oppression, all kinds of things, which we didn't just get through the newspapers, but we got from personal testimony. So there was also that great sense of understanding that India is not just about the big cities, it's also about the margins which are treated like colonies, and we need to understand what life means there, what is the experience of those places. So there was that. Then of course you already mentioned the Mandal agitation. So there's a very strong understanding of caste asymmetry and hierarchy and how that plays out. So everything that we did also as students or as young people involved in the art world was proceeding along with and within these contexts. So that awareness of context and seeing yourself as having that kind of agency to bear witness to these situations, that was really crucial. It kind of unfolded later in time. We realized how precious those experiences had been. But it's something that forever after, even if we're thinking of the individual practice of an artist, we're also thinking about these questions. What does this mean in a social context? What are the political crises here? What are the philosophical questions at stake? So I think this is important when you're curating, but I think also when you're an artist, because all too often there's a kind of ideology, whether you're a visual artist or a poet or a filmmaker, there's a sense that your practice comes first. But I think it's important to remember that because you have the power to bear witness, you also have a responsibility to think about the vulnerable, the ones who have no voice, and to see how you can stand alongside of those positions.
One thought, and it could lead to a question, is like nowadays galleries have become the very space or like the most common space to curate a work or to show a work. So the first question is, how do you think of a space when it comes to curation? Like, let it be outdoors, indoors, which geopolitical place you are in, or how does the term space, what do you first think when you see the work and the space, or first you see the space and the work, or what is your rhythm you go around when you want? It's about the whole thing about space, yeah. When you curate it in a space.
First of all, we talk about what kind of curator. Is it an independent curator, like Ranjit and me, or is it a curator who is the director of a museum, the head curator of a museum? So those are two very different kinds of practices and different forms of negotiations that we're talking about. As an independent practitioner, I'm invited to curate a show, for example, at Chitrakala Parishath, because they saw my show in Calcutta and then they invited me here. And again, even the KGS show, I have curated it in two very different spaces. The Imami Art is a gallery, and the CKP, is not a white cube space. It is a space that we actually turned into a kind of white cube through the preparation for this exhibition. We revamped the whole space to make it more habitable for this show. So these questions cannot only be answered by the curator. The curator is then negotiating with that particular institution, whether it is a gallery or whether it's a museum, whether it's a project space, or whether you are being invited by the municipal authorities to make a work in a public art space. So these questions cannot just be answered only by the curator. They will be then answered by both the curator in conversation with the artist, and both of them in conversation with whoever is the hosting authority, the ones who are inviting you to do the show. But at the same time, I have now only spoken about institutionally. There is also the possibility that all of you can come together, make a collective, and go ahead and put up a show in your friend's house, and then invite all your fellow students and faculty to it. And there have been models for these kinds of shows as well. Hansel Ulrich Obrist, for instance, So working within institutions, that's a very different, kind of model. The reason why I work within institutions is because I know that there are large numbers of people who want to see art and who want to have access to art, especially in a country like ours, which is built on huge asymmetries. So when I'm standing there giving a speech during the opening and there are like 400 people who've come in and who are waiting to, for the speeches to end and to enter the gallery, and then who are populating those galleries. Like I couldn't even enter into those galleries. I couldn't even take pictures of my own show. They weren't even going down for dinner. They were just, completely, absorbed by the show. So that means something to me. So I don't mind the fact that I had swollen feet at the end of 10 days while putting up that show, because there will be thousands of people there who are going to come and see it and for whom it will mean something. So for me, it's also an ethical question of why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's why I have worked in places like the NGMA Bombay, again, which are very bureaucratic, very difficult spaces. I mean, you might end up getting a nervous breakdown sometimes having to negotiate with those authorities who will make you cry for every little thing. And yet I do it because I believe that the work that I want to do must reach as many people as possible. In a country where there is no art education, where people really love art and want to learn more about art, but they do not have access. Because our society, despite Ambedkar and despite Ambedkar's revolution, it is still a society which is built on casteist reflexes. And that is why everybody does not have access to art education, to art.
How it's important to know how to actually work with the possibilities of whichever space you're presented with. I mean, like you're suggesting, space is not neutral. It's always inscribed with some power relationships, some possibilities. I think we both have actually the privilege of working in many ecologies of the art world. So with biennials, with festivals, with private galleries, museums, foundations, and each time there's a different kind of possibility and a different relationship with the audience and how you work that out. Sometimes the solutions are very, very artisanal. It's simply which language your wall text is in. So over the years, I think we've tried hard to insist on bilingual, at least, wall texts, because that's the first gesture of invitation or not. Quite often in many of our galleries, it's always only in English. So that's, you're already saying that if you're not Anglophone, you're not welcome in some sense. So how do you work against that? It could be a simple question like that. But also we find that something like the Serendipity Arts Festival, because it doesn't have a necessarily tight bureaucratic notion of itself, actually allows you from one edition to the next to have that freedom to present new work, to in fact use the exhibition as a research occasion, and to develop different kinds of connections with the audience in a very meaningful way. Again, whether you're an artist or a curator, I mean, our real medium is the audience, in a way. Whatever else your medium or our medium might be, that public consciousness is a very important medium, and how we work with that is crucial to our practice. So you need to push against that, even if you're working in a white cube where, galleries have their thing to do in life. Yeah, I mean, they are commercial establishments, and that's correct, because that is what they do. Public institutions have something else. They have a different mandate. So it's no use expecting an institution to do something that is not in its nature. But having said that, there's a lot of space where you can experiment, you can open those doors up. And I think that's what we should focus on. Try to see problems as opportunities. And really that attitude has helped us as well as other colleagues around the world to really open doors up and invite more people into this discussion and into artistic practice.
But students who are basically students or students who just graduated from college, what would you look out for? What is the kind of work you would be interested in showcasing?
So again, I would not go with any predetermined ideas. I would look at the work, and then I would let the work inform my curatorial concept. So again, I'm not going to say that just because this is a younger generation artist, I don't go with cliches or with stereotypes that they will not be doing what the older generation is doing and so forth. I just attend to the work, attend to the call of the work. What is that work saying to me? That is important. And I think that's again something to loop back to what I was saying earlier. You have to be open always. That openness is very, very important. The moment you go with any form of dogma, or if you feel that, I've already arrived at something and I'm just going to basically repeat that for the next 20, 25 years, you've had it. You're never going to grow, The openness is the first step to learning and to growing as well.
As young artists, can you give us a few tips or something that you practice that would be helpful for us to curate our own shows?
To self-curate?
Yeah.
And the reason why you are saying self-curate is because you feel that you don't have enough younger curators around you who you could.
No, this is a context of the annual display.
Oh, okay, for your own self. Okay, so like you're talking about curating in the sense of composing your works, your ideas, bringing in a certain coherence to it. Okay, fine. So again, this is not something where I would speak in an abstract manner. I would engage with the practice and then see, what are the fault lines, what are the fractures, and then how do you actually assemble things together, But one of the things that I would sort of say is that there is a particular phase when you are not sure, you're unstable, and then you arrive at some kind of a conceptual clarity. When you arrive at that conceptual clarity, you should be able to articulate that clarity for yourself, not in the way that today, for example, every artist sort of has become a kind of proposal artist, where they write the proposal and then they make the work to fit the proposal. So that's not what I'm asking you to do. But when you arrive at a certain conceptual clarity in that moment of your practice, you should be able to articulate it, not through cliches or abstractions. You don't have to use the word ontology or epistemology, not at all. But what you do need to do is to be able to find that particular moment where you are able to marry your intuition, the early intuitions, that allowed you to arrive at this stage, with a certain distillation of where you have come to. So it's always arriving at that sar, what we call the sar. The distillation of what you've reached, where you have reached.
Can you emphasize on that, like how we can reach?
Okay, so now again, what I'm talking about here sounds like an abstraction, but it isn't, because you will know that when we say a painter or a good artist knows when to stop painting, right, or canvas. So you know that, and you know that because you allow yourself complete freedom, but you also put certain constraints on yourself. So overindulgence will just lead you to something which is not productive at all. So again, discipline and self-criticality comes in. Now again, the word self-criticality sounds like an abstraction, but it isn't. Because the most important, again, another lesson that I can share from my own practice is self-criticality. That is, you have to constantly ask yourself questions and keep yourself in a state of being slightly unstable. The stutter is better than the polished articulation. I stutter a lot, as you can see, but it has never stopped me from making the things that I have done or writing the things that I do. I always allow myself, even if I have many decades of experience, I allow myself that sense of instability. I allow myself the privilege of, or rather, the freedom of stutterance. It's very important. Because the moment you feel you've arrived at something, then you just start dishing out the same thing, and then you find the right collectors or whatever, and then you're in the market, and that's it. It's done, you know. But if you always allow yourself that sense of being unstable, which means that you're ready to learn, you're open to criticism, and the first criticism should come from yourself. You don't have to wait for somebody else to tell you, and you know that in your mind and your heart when you know that you're bullshitting. So you should have a very good BS meter. You know, that's the most, self-criticality I think is a very important thing. And that self-criticality will allow you to also compose and bring things together in your work. And again, as I said, there is no mantra for it, because each person's practice is very different. So I cannot espouse a generalization. Art education, do you find it in the institutions like MS University and so forth, or JNU, or is it something that you find outside of the institutions? So this question would be great for somebody like Ranjit and me, because we did not study art history at any of these institutions, neither MSU nor JNU, and we taught ourselves art history. So
we were blessed to grow up with Adajania and Ranjit.
So we also had an ethos of questioning and self-questioning. We were surrounded by canonical figures from various disciplines, not just art history, but also cinema, also philosophy, architecture, poetry, music. So we were really blessed to be at in that moment in the late 80s and 90s in Bombay. So that was an unusual and a unique situation. But I think today even curation has become professionalized. When I started curating, for instance, I would even go to the Dawa Bazaar in Bombay to get that particular shade of purple paint. I'm right down on my knees and working with my hands. I was still doing that. I mean, you can ask the students who came to help at the show, So that's the kind of curator I am. I'm a hands-on curator, and I sort of, work at every level. Again, when it comes to art history, for instance, because I'm outside of the academy, I have always been able to dynamize my reading of art history and to come up with lost histories which need to be aired and which need visibility. I have been able to break a lot of new ground because I'm not within that ivory tower of the academy. So I think that there's also an advantage of being the outsider. It allows you to move faster. It also means that then you do not participate in the fossilization of knowledge, because in an academy or in any institution, knowledge has to in a way be academicized, fossilized, before it is sort of broken or ruptured and you move to the next point. So I think that it helps to be outside of the academy. Good. Sorry, just give me a minute.
Two responses to that, and Brigu, to your question. Over the years we've asked ourselves this question, which is why we've also been very active on what we began to call the para-academic scene in Bombay. There would be very nimble platforms like Gyan Prabha, for instance, or Arbor for a while, or we did a festival called what we call Winter. So these were sort of on the side of the academy with the same rigor and the same attentiveness, but maybe with more nimbleness and energy and a transdisciplinary kind of approach. Because I think it's important to not give up on academic space. So I think there'll be three things that could be done. I'm fascinated by the idea of cross-training. So not only the training that you are committed to, but also training in another discipline on the side. So I think some kind of interdisciplinarity would be very good. Also going back to how we grew up, that was the circumstance. We were lucky. It happened that there were all these marvelous people that we grew up with. But how can that be codified? I mean, is that completely impossible? In a city as culturally rich as Bangalore, for instance, that could be achieved by bringing in practitioners from
novelists, filmmakers, dramaturges. Yeah.
So maybe that's one way of doing it. The other thing is that both of us were hugely impressed by when you keep saying evening college as if it's some kind of option to a day college. But the incredible energy here and the experiences that people bring from the rest of their life, that itself is a huge resource that could be codified in some way through. Our friends in management have all kinds of terms for this. Reverse mentoring, peer-to-peer education. But I think those options are all worth exploring. I think it would help to self-disrupt what you're saying. So the academy doesn't get fossilized because there's new impulses and new knowledge coming in and new questions. I don't know if this is helpful.
No, this is absolutely helpful.
Conducted or articulated and it can't flourish in a vacuum. There's always a political context. And we are all citizens. So you can't divide yourself. You can't say, well, now on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays I'll be a citizen and the rest of the time I'll be an artist.
I'll be an artist, yeah, exactly.
So everything you do, it comes to, consider a very basic thing, the freedom of expression. I mean, you want to express something. There are times when you're looking over your shoulder to say, oh my God, what might happen to me if I say this or paint this or film this? Why should we be in such situations at all? So, you need to develop a political consciousness so that, and it's not something radical or revolutionary, it's fundamental. And this is still a democracy for what it's worth. And we are citizens, so those responsibilities are part of how you perform yourself as artists as well. And you're dealing with the public sphere all the time. Audiences will come in, some of them may understand what you're doing, others may not. It just deepens and enriches your sensibility. I don't think it's not really an option. And every choice you make is political at some level. Even if you say, well, I'm not really political, that's also a political choice. And things are going to get to a point where it's not going to be an option. You will have to take some kind of stand. Also, it so often depends on who you are, literally. We are, when I say we are citizens, that sounds like we're neutral. But we all come from somewhere with some asymmetry or some grievance, or some sense of historical wrong, or some actual suffering. All those questions show up in the art we make, the things we write, the things we paint, the films we make, installations we set up. So there's, you have to be a whole person and question these, all of these things. Each one of us is a collage in some way, right? So we're bringing that together. So political consciousness is also about piecing that collage of the self together.
That's beautifully put. Piecing that collage
Yeah, it's
together.
very beautiful.
But a collage also has fault lines and fractures. Don't forget that. So another thing that I'd just like to add to what Ranjit is saying is that having a political or developing a political consciousness does not mean making bad politically kind of illustrative art. So we see a lot of that very bad art, which in the name of doing some, in the name of responding to the political moment. So I would not sort of suggest that everybody now sort of start responding to whatever the current political event is, and then start making art around that. Developing a political consciousness is to develop empathy, compassion, to be able to develop a further eye, like in the Jain miniatures, which is that the eye which is not just looking at herself or himself, but is also able to connect with people next to them, and then even people further than them. So I think that's very, very important. So I am not suggesting that you now start making bad illustrative art. The developing of a political consciousness takes years. And it also means, like when I shared with you very honestly, that I grew up a Gandhian, but then with the kinds of political events that were happening as I came of age, it also allowed me to change my political perspective. Again, not because it is trendy to be an Ambedkarite. No, because I genuinely understood what were the limitations of Gandhian philosophy. And then I make that move. So that is part of developing your political consciousness. So that you don't just talk to people like yourself. You don't speak in the language that only you and 5 other people understand. Why do I make this show here? It's important for me because when I see at the opening that there are people from all age groups, different kinds of professions, different genders, different religions, people speaking different languages. That is what heartens me. And that is why the very first gallery of the KGS show foregrounds the notion of multiplicity and pluralism. So that, again, what is this curator's political consciousness? You know, I'm not just showing you the 5 or 6 paintings that you can count on your fingers, which KGS made directly in response to a political issue, which was the city is not for burning, or the terracotta reliefs, in response to the Bangladesh war. My whole show is not about just the political moments. It is about political philosophy. It is about developing a political consciousness. And it is about safeguarding what is truly important for us as the citizens of this country, which is that we have a right to be multiple, to be many. And we cannot or should not be punished because we wish to be multiple or different.
Whether it is an artist or art enthusiast.
What, Ma?
Whether it is an artist or art enthusiast, the definition of art or opinion will be keep on changing according to their age or experience. So at this point of time, what is your definition about art in contemporary world?
Yeah. What is the excess? What is it that resists interpretation? What is it that, you said earlier, the call of the art object that also comes from an incredible Japanese art movement from the 1950s called Butai. Some of you would probably be familiar with that. Right? They said you have to listen to the cry of the material. So these are things that interest me as someone interested in art. I don't start with a definition of, this is art and this is non-art. In fact, maybe you should, what you've shown of Abanindranath and so on, I mean, that was all not particularly thought of as art, but you're turning to it for particular reasons. So, yeah. I think it's important, whether you're a practitioner or someone looking at art, it's important to always keep that notion of adbhut, the wonderment alive. And if something provokes that, I think that might be a good definition of art. What is it that disturbs me and art makes me ask questions? What is it that makes me exult? What is it that gives me some kind of ecstasy in the sense of standing outside of myself? These are things that art does at its best. So I don't want to start with some laying down rules for a canon and say, okay, this works. So I don't think that one can do that.
Especially today, the way artistry has developed today, in the 21st century, I don't think there could be any single definition of art. But perhaps and I agree with everything that Ranjit said about, what is it in excess of? I would call that, like, what is the surplus, the aesthetic and the philosophical surplus that art leaves behind? That's what I'm interested in. But also perhaps I would like to take your question, from another perspective and say, what is it that, art in a way should not be doing? And I use this kind of more subjunctive kind of a way of approaching this question, because I feel, for instance, there are a lot of art today which is very, document heavy, which is didactic, which is, where you have a lot of archival documents put up on the wall, and, there is no affective purchase. There is no emotional connect with that kind of art. And you see that a lot of that throughout the world. So that's the kind of art that I do not relate to. And that's why I actually created an anthology which I titled as Some Things That Only Art Can Do. Because what has happened today, and I called it the lexicon of affective knowledge. Because what has happened today is that art has always been made to serve some political purpose or ecological purpose or any other ideological purpose, So art has been reduced to that particular political reality. And therefore, my manifesto in that anthology which I did for the Raza Foundation was that, can we go back to, what is it that art can do? Not just art which is then reduced to a particular, ecological reality or so forth. Where you use art to sort of solve some other problem or issue. Because there are things that only art can do. art can actually sort of make you not just think but also feel, to feel in a kind of full-bodied manner. And feeling is also not just something which is as a kind of binaristic opposition to thinking, because affect for me is also a place of political resistance. It's not just making illustrative political art.
Yeah, because I think it dramatizes this question of artistic intentionality. I mean, you are putting something out because you know what it is, or you think you know what it is. And then, trust me, as a poet, I know how this is. When someone misunderstands a poem, I say to myself, why haven't they understood what I've put into it? But then, unless there's a grave misrepresentation of what you've done, I think it's interesting to also look at the whole array of interpretations that people bring to your work. And then you're able to stand aside and see yourself as one among other viewers of your own work. Philip Guston used to say this. I don't know if that's still a familiar name, the painter Philip Guston.
It is.
I sometimes don't know what to take for granted anymore as we go along. But Guston was also a brilliant writer. He actually wrote somewhere that when he begins to paint, there are 5 people around him. A little deeper into the painting, they leave the room and only he's left there. And when the painting's done, he leaves the room as well. So it's always been fascinating to think about what happens when you leave the room too, and then the painting has to work by itself. So that's a concept that this is a kind of scenario that I've thought about in relation to this question. The other interesting concept is something Frank Stella, the painter, used to talk about. He had this idea of the working space of a painting, which is, in his case, painting, but it works for every artwork. And he would say the meaning of the work gets made in the 5 feet away from it, between the object and the art object and the viewer. So I think we should place some trust in Stella's working space and think about, what is the play of interpretations and ideas that is happening, that your work is bringing forth among people. Yeah. So that would be kind of a long-winded response to a very precise question.
On what it is that you'd like to communicate, while you don't want to fix a particular interpretation and you want people to, as Ranjit was saying, have different ways of approaching your art, there may also be moments where through your interaction with the audience, you realize that perhaps you need to push your language further as well. So that's also the other side of it, Because somebody doesn't understand, you don't have to become full of yourself and say, oh, these people are idiots, and they don't understand, what kind of genius I am. So it can also be that, which it might become an invitation to actually push yourself further and to see what it is that you could actually improvise. We normally have a lot of women artist shows, but those are shows which try to sort of have this simplistic idea of, equating a woman with her mother goddess and so forth. And we've never had a show of women artists which actually is seen against the backdrop of Indian feminism. The feminist movement that emerged within our own context. So, for instance, I had the work of Shiba Chachi, who documented the women's movement, and she was also a part of the movement. Later on, her practice then moved on, into making multimedia installations, working in the interstices between gender and ecology and so forth. But where she began as part of the women's movement, taking those photographs of women agitating on the street, for instance, in the 1980s. So I showed that. I had Nilima Sheikh, who we also get a glimpse of in this show, who did When Champa Grew Up series, which was in response to the dowry killings in the 1980s, when women came out into the streets and fought against the murdering of these young girls, and also agitated to create a new law. So I had all of this in my show because I also wanted to show that women artists and the kind of feminism that they espouse is not just something that comes from the West. where you just name a few Western art historians and then annotate their work through that. That we have a active, lively history of Indian feminism, and I wanted that to actually come through. But to go back to your question, these were artists who were responding to a particular political reality, but when they were responding to that political reality, they were also responding to questions of artistic vocabulary, which is very important. If they were not doing that, then they would have just made some illustrative work. When you look at Nilima Sheikh's When Champa Grew Up, which is my favorite series, she, as I say also in the KGS show, she was making artworks which were where she was borrowing from the style of miniature paintings, Indian miniature paintings, which has this additive structure where you have a scattered narrative, a kind of cellular narrative, not a narrative where you only have a kind of singular male modernist kind of image. So she was working on developing her own artistic language to speak about this urgent political reality. So it's also about art making. It's not just about responding to the political moment. And through thinking through your materials, thinking through your structure, your narrative, you are able to better respond to a political reality, rather than just doing something that is an illustration of it. And as all feminists will teach you, the personal is the political. So when you say the personal choice, it is not just something that is insular. It is always something which is overlapping with what is happening in society. And that's why I talk about looking at reserves of empathy within you. Again, the word empathy has been overused, but it's important. Or compassion. Unless you're able to dredge up those reserves of empathy and compassion, you will not be able to join hands with the people who are sitting next to you. People who may be completely different from you, who may not speak your language, who may not belong to your religion, who may not have your privileges, and so forth.
As a curator, what do you think about art like this, which is complicated, also not complicated at the same time?
No, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and that's why earlier I was also talking about a lot of art where the explanation on the art is longer than or larger than the artwork itself, which can be, ineffectual. So I understand, your position, and I feel that, that kind of art is ingenuine, and it's not going to really go too far, except by those people, who are then part. You can be an autodidact, which is a self-starter, and you can teach things, disciplines, new disciplines to yourself, but you have to be a systematic autodidact, and that's very important. Because one of the reasons why people stop making art and then go into some other profession is that they are not systematic. And you have to be completely passionate about what you want to do. So you have to become like Mirabai, for instance. You have to have complete dhyana, because ilm, you were talking about dhwani, you are not going to be able to receive the dhwani from what you are doing unless you have dhyana, so dhwani will only happen through dhyana, it will happen through riyaz. So if you are ready to give all of yourself to whatever you're doing, only then will you be able to achieve what is important for you. If at any moment I had said while doing this show, oh, that's okay, this is not impossible, we won't be able to achieve it, or gosh, I can't walk anymore because my feet are so swollen that there's no way I have a terrible headache, impossible, I can't go ahead. If at any moment I had given up, we wouldn't have had the show that we did, right? So that's the kind of passion that you need, that passion, hard work, and also imagination, hard work without imagination is just drudgery. Even in the most difficult moments when we were there working on the exhibition and there were 5 people bombarding me with their needs or what we were lacking or what we didn't have, I was still composing the grids. of paintings, of archival documents, when I would shoo all of you away and say, I just need that moment. So that's the moment where I then allow my imagination to take wing. So even in the most difficult moments of your life, you can find that moment to allow yourself to enter into that zone where nobody can destabilize you. And I think that that's the only thing that I can share with you and to take away with you. That let nobody defeat you, never. Fight against every circumstance. And perhaps you might fail at the end of it all, but it's still worth failing while fighting, So fail, but go down fighting. If you have to go down fighting.